The first notice arrived on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that blends into memory without leaving a mark. Sunlight spilled across my driveway. The neighborhood looked calm, manicured lawns standing like proof of order and predictability. That was the illusion the HOA thrived on. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Inside that envelope, though, was the beginning of a nightmare designed to take my home piece by piece. The letter claimed I owed several $100s in fines for violations I didn't recognize. Improper trash can placement, landscaping noncompliance, late fees already added, even though the notice itself was supposedly the first warning. It was written in cold, official language, stamped with authority, and ended with a reminder that unpaid balances could result in legal action. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. HOAs made clerical errors sometimes. That was the benefit of the doubt I gave them. Back when I still believed this was about rules instead of revenue, I reviewed the violations one by one. Walking my property, comparing it to the HOA handbook I had followed for years, the trash cans had been stored properly. The lawn was trimmed, the hedges aligned, the exterior paint unchanged. There were no photographs attached to the notice, no dates listed, no explanation beyond vague accusations. It felt less like enforcement and more like a bill. I contacted the HOA through the proper channels, submitting a written request for clarification. Days passed without response. Then another letter arrived. This one was heavier in tone and lighter in patience. The balance had increased. New late fees had been added. The violations were repeated word for word, still without proof. But now the letter mentioned potential liens if the account remained unpaid. The calm neighborhood suddenly felt hostile, like the walls were closing in. That was when the pattern began to reveal itself. The HOA wasn't interested in correcting behavior. They were interested in escalation. Each notice arrived faster than the last. Each one added more fees. Administrative fees, processing fees, interest, penalties stacked on top of penalties. It was growing faster than any reasonable homeowner could keep up with. It was financial pressure disguised as governance. I started documenting everything. Dates, letters, postmarks, balances. The numbers didn't make sense. Fees appeared retroactively. Late notices were dated before the alleged violations. Payments I had made toward my regular dues were suddenly missing from their records, as if they had been erased to justify more charges. When I asked for an itemized statement, I received a generic summary that lumped everything together. Offering no transparency at all, neighbors began acting strangely. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked nervous, like they wanted to say something but were afraid of being overheard. The HOA board members, once friendly faces at annual meetings, now felt distant and untouchable. Their authority wasn't based on community anymore. It was enforced through paperwork and threats. The third notice was the one that changed everything. It wasn't just a demand for payment. It was a pre-lien warning. The language was unmistakable. If the balance wasn't paid in full within a short deadline, the HOA would move forward with placing a lien on my home. A lien that could eventually lead to foreclosure. All over fines I still didn't understand and violations I knew I hadn't committed. Fear crept in quietly. This wasn't about inconvenience anymore. This was about losing the place I had invested years of work into. The home where memories lived in the walls. The home I assumed was secure because I had followed the rules. The realization hit hard. Compliance wasn't protection. It was leverage they had already used. I sought legal advice, hoping for reassurance. What I received instead was a warning. Each HOAs had broad powers, especially when homeowners didn't act quickly. The process was often designed to overwhelm people into paying, even when the charges were questionable. Fighting back was possible, but it required persistence, documentation, and a willingness to challenge authority that thrived on intimidation. As the deadline approached, the HOA sent another letter. This one referenced prior notices that never existed. It claimed repeated attempts at resolution. It painted me as uncooperative and negligent. It was rewriting the story, creating a paper trail that made them look reasonable and me look irresponsible. That was when it became clear this wasn't random. It was procedural, systematic, intentional. Late one evening, while reviewing the latest notice, I noticed something small but significant. A formatting error. A fee category that didn't exist in the HOA bylaws. A charge labeled vaguely enough to avoid scrutiny, but specific enough to inflate the balance. It raised a question I couldn't ignore. If this fee wasn't authorized, how many others weren't either? That question opened the door to a much darker possibility. What if this wasn't just happening to me? What if the HOA had been doing this for years? It's quietly extracting money from homeowners who either couldn't fight back or didn't realize they were being targeted. The thought was unsettling, but it fit the pattern too well to dismiss. The balance now sat high enough to feel suffocating. Every letter ended with urgency. Every notice reduced the time to respond. The pressure was constant, designed to push me into paying just to make it stop. But instead of paying, I decided to dig deeper, because something about this felt less like enforcement and more like a scheme hiding behind authority. As the final pre-lien deadline loomed, I gathered every document, every receipt, every piece of correspondence. I didn't know yet how far this would go, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about fines anymore. This was about control, money, and a system that counted on silence. And as I prepared to push back for the first time, I had no idea how many secrets the HOA had buried beneath years of fake fees, or how hard they would fight to keep them hidden. The fear had transformed into something sharper: determination. The HOA had made their move, and now it was clear they expected submission. Instead, they got scrutiny. I started with the bylaws. Every HOA liked to hide behind them, so I treated them like a map. Page by page, line by line, I compared each alleged violation and fee against what the governing documents actually allowed. The gaps were impossible to ignore. Several of the charges on my account were not authorized anywhere. Others were allowed only after a documented warning process that never happened. The HOA hadn't just bent the rules. They had ignored them entirely. The next step was public records. HOA boards hated transparency, but they operated as legal entities. Their filings were accessible if you knew where to look. I requested financial disclosures, meeting minutes, and annual reports. The process was slow and met with resistance, but what came back was more revealing than I expected. Revenue from fines and penalties had skyrocketed over the past few years, far outpacing normal dues increases. Maintenance expenses, meanwhile, had barely changed. The HOA wasn't improving the neighborhood. They were monetizing it. Patterns emerged quickly. Fines increased sharply after a change in board leadership. Late fees were applied aggressively, often compounding within weeks. Liens had been placed on multiple homes, many for relatively small balances that ballooned out of control. Foreclosures had occurred quietly. Properties later sold under circumstances that raised serious questions. The more I dug, the more the story shifted from personal to systemic. This wasn't a rogue letter or an overzealous compliance officer. This was a business model. I began reaching out to neighbors discreetly. At first, people were hesitant. The HOA had cultivated fear well. But once I showed them my paperwork, the walls started to crack. Stories poured out. Surprise fines. Notices never received. Payments lost. Threats of legal action that came without warning. Some had paid thousands just to avoid stress. Others were still trapped. Balances growing month after month with no clear explanation. One homeowner shared something crucial. They had attended a board meeting where fines were discussed, not as enforcement, but as revenue stabilization. The phrase stuck. This wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about funding lifestyles, legal retainers, and cushioned reserves without raising dues publicly. Fines were quiet. Fines were deniable. Fines could be blamed on homeowners. As my own deadline approached, the HOA escalated. A formal lien was prepared. Legal fees were added to my account, even though no court action had been filed yet. It was preemptive punishment, designed to make resistance financially impossible. They wanted me buried in costs before I ever reached a judge. That was when I filed my response. The lawsuit wasn't flashy. It was precise. It challenged the validity of the fines, the lack of due process, the unauthorized fees, and the HOA's pattern of financial misconduct. I attached evidence, documents, comparisons, timelines, and most importantly, I requested discovery. Discovery was their weakness. Because it forced transparency, the HOA responded aggressively, attempting to dismiss the case. They painted me as a chronic violator, a troublemaker, someone refusing to take responsibility. But their filings were thin. Assertions without proof, confidence without substance. And as discovery moved forward, the cracks widened. Internal emails revealed discussions about maximizing compliance income.
Spreadsheets tracked homeowners.
Not by community involvement, but by fine potential. Certain addresses were flagged repeatedly. Others were ignored entirely. Enforcement wasn't equal. It was strategic, even worse. Legal correspondence showed that the HOA's own attorneys had raised concerns about due process years earlier. Those concerns were ignored. The board knew the risks and chose profit anyway. That knowledge changed everything. This wasn't negligence. It was intent. Word spread quickly once the lawsuit became public record. More homeowners came forward. Some joined as witnesses. Others prepared their own cases. The HOA tried to regain control by sending out mass notices, attempting to collect balances before scrutiny intensified. It only made them look guiltier. The court denied the HOA's motion to dismiss. The case was moving forward. For the first time since that first envelope arrived, the power dynamic shifted. The HOA was no longer operating in the shadows. Every action was now part of a record. Every decision subject to review. But they weren't done fighting as the trial date approached. The HOA made one last attempt to force compliance. A settlement offer arrived, quietly. It wiped my balance clean in exchange for silence. No admission of wrongdoing. No reform. Just a clean exit if I agreed to walk away. I didn't accept. Because this was never just about my house anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been pressured into paying fake fines. Every family who lost their home quietly. Every neighbor who believed the HOA's authority was absolute. Walking away would have protected me, but it would have left the system intact. And as the courtroom doors opened and the evidence finally saw the light of day, it became clear the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't targeting my home. It was underestimating how far the truth could travel once it was forced out into the open. The trial didn't begin with drama. It began with documents. Stacks of them. Financial statements, emails, bylaws, meeting minutes. The kind of evidence that didn't need emotion to speak. It simply needed to be seen. The HOA's image unraveled piece by piece. Their claims of consistent enforcement collapsed under their own records. Homeowners with identical properties had wildly different violation histories. Fees were applied without warnings. Late notices were dated before invoices. Entire categories of charges had no authorization anywhere in the governing documents. The court focused on process first, or rather the lack of it. Due process was supposed to protect homeowners from arbitrary punishment. The HOA had bypassed it entirely. Notices were vague. Appeals were ignored. Hearings were either denied or conducted without proper documentation. The board acted as accuser, judge, and beneficiary. Financial scrutiny hit next. The HOA's accounts revealed something impossible to justify. Fine revenue wasn't incidental. It was foundational. Without fines, the budget would have collapsed. That meant the system required violations to function. It required escalation. It required pressure. Foreclosures that had once been dismissed as unfortunate consequences were re-examined. Balances that began under $1,000 had grown to tens of thousands through fees and legal costs. Homes were lost not because owners couldn't pay dues, because the HOA had engineered debt. The defense tried to argue authority. HOAs were granted broad powers, they said. But authority without adherence to its own rules wasn't authority. It was abuse. As testimony continued, the scope of the scheme became undeniable. Board members had personally approved fee increases tied to budget shortfalls. Enforcement priorities were adjusted based on projected revenue. Even the hose management company was implicated. Incentivized through contracts that rewarded aggressive collections, the court ruled decisively. The fines against my home were void. The lien was invalid. The HOA was ordered to refund improperly collected fees to multiple homeowners. Board members were removed. The management contract was terminated. New oversight was imposed. Policies were rewritten under supervision, but the most powerful outcome wasn't legal. It was awareness. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now spoke openly. Stories that had been whispered became warnings. The illusion of the HOA as an untouchable authority was gone. In its place was accountability. The kind that only appears after someone refuses to back down. My home remained mine, not because I paid fake fines, but because I challenged them. And in doing so, I exposed a system that relied on fear, silence, and complexity to survive. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight, but steadily. Transparency replaced intimidation. Meetings became quieter, not because people were afraid to speak, but because decisions were finally being made in the open. The HOA still existed, but it no longer ruled through threat. Looking back, the first notice feels almost insignificant. Just paper and ink. But it represented something much larger. A reminder that systems only work when people believe they're unchallengeable. This one wasn't. And for every homeowner watching this unfold, the lesson was simple. Authority doesn't make something right. Paper doesn't make something true. And sometimes, the only way to protect your home is to fight for it.